The horse was the most beautiful animal Jane Covington had ever seen, and it was standing in a dead man's stall being cared for by a man who had no reason to love it. She had come to Roy Fairchild's ranch with a simple enough purpose. Her husband, Thomas Covington, had been dead for 4 months. The ranch that bore his name was struggling. The creditors were circling like buzzards over a carcass, and she had exactly one asset left that might bring enough money to hold them off through the winter. The bay gelding Thomas had called Copper was supposedly out here on the Fairchild property, had been here for nearly 2 years, and she had come to collect what was rightfully hers. She had not expected to find the animal gleaming. She had not expected to find it fat and well-muscled, its coat brushed until it caught the morning light like hammered bronze. She had not expected to find fresh hay in the stall, clean water in the trough, and a handmade cedar name played above the door with the name Copper carved into it with the kind of careful patience that meant something to the man who had done the carving. She had not expected Roy Fairchild to look at her the way he did when she walked into his barn and told him why she had come. He stood there in the golden dust of the barn, a big man with broad shoulders and dark hair shot through with early gray at the temples, and his face went through something complicated, something that looked, for just one moment, like guilt. And then, just beneath the guilt, something she could not name, something that made her stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the 4 months of grief she had been carrying like a stone in her chest. "Mrs. Covington," he said, and his voice was low and careful, the way a man speaks when he is choosing every word. "I have come for the horse," she said. "Thomas left debts. The horse is mine by law." Roy Fairchild looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the horse. Then he looked back at her, and in his eyes was a secret she had not yet earned the right to hear. "Sit down," he said quietly. "There are some things about your husband and that horse that you need to know before you decide what to do with either of them." And that was when Jane Covington understood, with a cold clarity that ran through her like creek water in January, that she had come here knowing one story and was about to leave knowing another one entirely. The story of how she arrived at Roy Fairchild's barn on that October morning in 1882 began, as most stories about women in the West did, with a man making choices that would shape her life without her knowledge or consent. Jane had married Thomas Covington in the spring of 1878 when she was 22 years old and he was 30. She had come from Missouri with her parents and younger brother, part of the great westward press of families looking for something better than what the war had left behind. Thomas had been charming in the way that certain men are charming before you learn to read the warning signs beneath the surface. He had a ready laugh and an easy manner, and he talked about the future the way some men talk about a country they have never visited but feel very certain exists. He had a small parcel of land near the town of Harlow Creek in eastern Colorado, and a plan to turn it into something. And Jane had believed in the plan because she had wanted very badly to believe in something. Her family had lost nearly everything in Missouri, and the weight of that loss had made hope feel almost dangerous. But Thomas's confidence had been a warm place to stand, and so she had stood there and called it love. For the first 2 years, it had been close enough to love that the difference did not matter. They had built a proper house together and planted a kitchen garden and started a small herd of cattle, and there had been moments of real tenderness between them that Jane still could not dismiss even now, even knowing what she knew. But Thomas had a darkness in him that he kept well hidden until you had given him enough of yourself that leaving became complicated. He was not a cruel man in the way some men were cruel. He did not raise his hand. But he kept secrets the way other men kept money, hoarding them close to his chest, and those secrets had a way of costing people around him in ways they never saw coming. The horse Copper had arrived at their property in the spring of 1880. Jane had asked where it came from, and Thomas had been vague in the way he was sometimes vague, which meant she did not press. Copper was a fine animal, a 4-year-old bay gelding with a white blaze and an even temperament, and Thomas had seemed unusually attached to it. He had spent hours in the barn with that horse in a way he did not spend hours with anything else, and Jane had found it both tender and slightly strange. 6 months later, Thomas had come to her with a proposition that had bothered her from the moment he spoke it. Roy Fairchild, who ran the largest and most successful ranch in the county, had approached Thomas about boarding copper on the Fairchild property. The Fairchild Ranch had better facilities, more experienced hands, and more land for a horse to run. Thomas said it made practical sense. Jane had asked why a man with a full working ranch of his own would want to take on someone else's horse, and Thomas had given her the vague answer again. She had let it go because she had learned by then which arguments with Thomas were worth having. Copper went to the Fairchild Ranch in the fall of 1880, and Thomas continued to pay his board fees with remarkable reliability, which was unusual enough that Jane noticed it. Thomas was not a reliable man with money. He was generous to a fault with strangers and careless with expenses, and she was always the one finding ways to stretch what they had through the lean months. But Copper's board at the Fairchild Ranch was always paid on time, without argument, without the sighing and the delay that attended most of their other financial obligations. She had wondered about it and then let herself stop wondering because there was always something more immediately urgent to attend to. Thomas died in March of 1882. It was not a dramatic death, which somehow made it harder to process. He developed a lung fever in February, and it took him steadily over the course of 5 weeks. He was 34 years old, and at the end he had been frightened, which was the most honest she had ever seen him, and she had sat beside him and held his hand because that is what you do for a person who is dying regardless of how complicated your feelings about them have become. He had tried to tell her something at the end. She was almost certain of it. He had held her hand and looked at her with those fever-bright eyes and started to say something, and then the effort had been too much and the moment had passed. She had carried the weight of that unfinished sentence for 4 months without knowing what it was supposed to mean. The debts he left behind were the first revelation. They were substantial, significantly more than she had known about, and they had their hooks in the property in ways that were going to require either a significant sum of money or the sale of the land itself to resolve. She had spent the first 2 months after his death trying to understand the full shape of what he had left her. The second revelation had come from Sheriff Aldous Prout, who was not a bad man, but was not a particularly tactful one either. He had come to see her in May, hat in hand, with the awkward expression of a man who has information he does not especially want to deliver. Thomas Covington, the sheriff explained carefully, had been under quiet investigation for the 18 months before his death. Nothing had been proven. Nothing had ever gone to trial. But there had been questions about his business dealings, about certain cattle that appeared on his land without clear documentation of purchase, about money that moved in ways that did not entirely account for itself. Jane had sat with that information for 2 more months before she did anything with it. She had turned it over in her mind like a stone. She kept expecting to find something alive under. What she found instead was that it answered certain questions about Thomas's behavior while simultaneously making her feel as though she had been living in a house whose walls had been made of something other than what she had been told. It was the lawyer, a dry-voiced man named Harold Fitch, who had eventually pointed her toward the horse. In sorting through Thomas's remaining assets, Fitch had noted the bay gelding currently boarded at the Fairchild Ranch. The board fees had stopped naturally with Thomas's death. Roy Fairchild had sent no notice of collection, made no demand. The horse simply sat on his property, apparently still being cared for, and that struck Fitch as unusual enough to mention. Jane had written a letter to Roy Fairchild in August. He had written back with a brevity that told her nothing. Yes, the horse was there. Yes, it was well. He would be available to discuss the matter at her convenience. She had waited until October because she had needed the summer to get her feet under her. She had needed to grieve, which was a more complicated process than she had anticipated. because what she was grieving was not entirely Thomas, but also the version of Thomas she had believed in, and also the version of herself that had believed in him, and those were different animals that required different kinds of mourning. She had driven herself to the Fairchild Ranch in her buckboard on a clear October Tuesday, wearing her second-best dress because she was a widow in reduced circumstances, and vanity was a luxury. But she was still Jane Covington, and she was not going to show up looking like she had given up. The Fairchild Ranch was everything that her own property was not. It was orderly and substantial, the kind of place that had been built with a long view in mind. The main house was a well-kept two-story with a covered porch running the full front width. The barn was large and properly maintained. There were horses in the pasture that moved with the ease of well-fed, well-handled animals. The whole property had the particular quality of a place that was run by someone who paid attention and did not cut corners. A young hand named Pete, who looked about 17, and had the cheerful manner of someone who had not yet had occasion to be otherwise, had met her at the gate and led her to the barn where Roy Fairchild was working. She had walked into that barn and found Copper, and found Roy Fairchild, and found the moment she had been building toward without knowing it for 4 months, and nothing after that had been simple. Roy brought her a wooden chair from a corner of the barn, and placed it near the tack room door with a courtesy that was quiet and unshowy, the kind of good manners that come from genuine regard for other people rather than performance. He did not offer to shake her hand, which she noted, because a lot of men in 1882 were beginning to do that with women in business situations, and she had opinions about men who withheld it as a small power play. He simply treated her like a person who had come with a serious matter and deserved a serious conversation. He leaned against the stall door opposite her. In the October light coming through the barn's high windows, she could see him more clearly now. He was perhaps 35, broad through the shoulders and lean through the middle, with a face that had been weathered by years outdoors into something honest and angular. His eyes were dark gray, an unusual color that she noticed because eyes are what you look at when you are trying to understand what a person is not saying. "You said there were things I need to know," Jane said. She folded her hands in her lap and kept her voice level. She had become very good at keeping her voice level. "Yes," Roy said. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was deciding how to begin, not whether to begin. "How much did Thomas tell you about why Copper came to be here?" "He said it was practical, better facilities." Roy nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming what he had expected to hear. "That was one part of it. What was the other part?" He looked at the horse for a moment. Copper stood placidly, one hip cocked, enormous dark eyes half closed in the warmth of the barn. Then Roy looked back at Jane. "Copper was involved in a debt Thomas owed to a man named Garrett Cole," Roy said. "Cole runs an operation about 40 miles east of here. He is not a good man in most of the ways that matter. He had some claim on that horse, whether legitimate or not I was never entirely certain, and Thomas was afraid he would come and take it." Jane felt something move in her chest, a slow shifting of a weight she had been carrying. "So he brought Copper here." "He asked me to keep the horse," Roy said. "He told me some of what was happening, not all of it. He asked me not to say anything to you because he did not want you worried." There it was. One more decision Thomas had made on her behalf without her knowledge. She breathed through the familiar tightness of that. "Why did you agree?" she asked. Roy was quiet for a beat longer than was comfortable. "Thomas and I grew up together," he said finally. "Not friends exactly, but we knew each other from when we were boys. His family and mine had neighboring properties back in Kansas before my father moved us out here. I knew him long enough to understand that he meant well more often than he managed to do well." He paused. "And I knew enough about Garrett Cole to understand that the horse needed a safer place than a small ranch that a man like Cole would have no hesitation walking onto." Jane looked at him steadily. "You kept the horse to protect it?" "Yes." "You kept paying attention to it for 2 years, and for 4 months after Thomas died with no compensation and no request from anyone. Yes. Why? Roy met her eyes, and there it was again, that thing she had seen at the beginning, that complicated something that sat beneath the guilt. Because the horse did not do anything wrong, he said, and because I thought you might need it eventually and it ought to be worth something when you came for it. Jane sat with that for a moment. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horse, and the autumn air coming through the cracks in the wood. Copper shifted in his stall and blew a soft breath through his nostrils. "There is more," she said. It was not a question. Roy looked at her with an expression that was something close to respect. "Yes," he said, "there is more." He told her about Garrett Cole in the methodical way that a careful man tells a difficult story, making sure the foundation is solid before he builds on it. Cole was a man who operated in the gray territory between legitimate ranching and outright theft, the kind of operation that was unfortunately not uncommon in eastern Colorado in 1882, where the law was stretched thin across large distances, and a man with enough money and enough willingness to use force could make his own rules. Cole had come to Roy's ranch in June, 2 months after Thomas's death, with 2 men and a specific claim on copper. He had produced a document that purported to show Thomas had signed the horse over to him as payment of a debt. The document was almost certainly forged, but in a jurisdiction where the nearest federal court was a 3-day ride, almost certainly was not the same thing as provably. Roy had looked at Cole and his men and his document, and had told him, without particular drama, that he would need more than a piece of paper before he handed over an animal in his care. Cole had made certain implications about what happened to people who were unhelpful to him. Roy had listened to those implications with the patience of a man who had been threatened before and not found it productive to panic. Cole had left. He had not, as far as Roy knew, given up. He had simply not yet found a strategy that would work. "He will come back," Roy said. "Probably sooner now that word has gotten around that you came here today. He will know the horse's ownership is being examined." Jane was quiet for a moment, absorbing the shape of the problem. It was a more complicated shape than she had arrived with this morning. "Can the document be challenged?" "A good lawyer could probably do it," Roy said. "Thomas's signature was distinctive. Any document examiner who knew his hand could likely show the forged one for what it is." "Harold Fitch," Jane said, almost to herself. Thomas's lawyer was a dry man but a precise one, and precision was what this situation required. "Who?" "Thomas's lawyer. He is careful with documents. He would know Thomas's signature." She looked at Roy directly. "How much time do you think we have?" Roy tilted his head slightly. Though he was not lost on him, she could see that. "Weeks, maybe. If Cole decides to move fast, days." Jane stood up. She smoothed her skirt in a gesture that was more about steadying herself than any concern for her appearance. "Then I need to get to Harlow Creek and speak to Fitch today." Roy straightened away from the stall. "That is a 2-hour drive each way." "Yes. It will be dark before you get back." He seemed to be calculating something. "The roads between here and town are not reliable after dark this time of year." She looked at him steadily. "Are you suggesting I stay?" He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, which she found she appreciated. "I am suggesting that driving alone after dark is a risk that does not serve you or the situation. I have a spare room. It is nothing elaborate, but it is clean and private. My housekeeper, Mrs. Alderman, is on the property." He met her eyes. "I am saying it as a practical matter, Mrs. Covington, nothing more." Jane considered him for a moment. She was a widow in reduced circumstances with a dead husband's secret debts and a possibly forged document threatening the one asset she had come to collect. She was also, she reminded herself firmly, a grown woman who could assess a situation and make a practical decision without it meaning anything that she was not ready for it to mean. "Thank you," she said. "I will take you up on that. After I have spoken to Fitch." The drive to Harlow Creek took her 2 hours and 10 minutes, and Harold Fitch was still in his office, which was fortunate. She explained the situation with Cole, and the document in the same level tone she had used with Roy, and watched Fitch's expression sharpen from its usual mild dryness into something more engaged. He knew Thomas's signature. He had 23 documents bearing it in his files. He would need to see Cole's document, but based on what she described, he was cautiously confident that a challenge could be mounted. There was also, he mentioned almost as an afterthought, a provision in territorial law regarding contested claims on livestock that might be useful. He would need a few days to prepare the proper filings. A few days. She drove back toward the Fairchild ranch in the gathering dusk, the Colorado evening painting itself in purple and orange above the flat horizon, and thought about what a few days meant. It meant she would need to return. It meant she would need to deal with Roy Fairchild again, which she found she did not particularly mind, which in itself felt like information worth examining. He was waiting in the yard when she came through the gate, which she noticed, and then decided not to assign too much meaning to. The young hand Pete took her horse and she walked with Roy to the house, and Mrs. Alderman, who was a solid woman of about 50 with the efficient manner of someone who ran a household rather than merely inhabiting it, had dinner ready and the spare room prepared. Dinner was a simple meal: beef stew and cornbread and coffee, and Roy sat across the table from her with the lantern light between them, and they talked about the situation with Cole in the practical way of two people working through a problem together. He asked good questions. He listened to her answers without trying to correct them or complete them, which she noticed because it was rarer than it should have been. At some point, the conversation shifted from Cole and the horse to other things, the way conversations do when two people are tired and the immediate pressure has been addressed, and the evening is sitting quietly around them. He asked about her property, and she told him honestly what she was facing. He did not offer advice she had not asked for, but when she described a specific drainage problem she was having with one of her pastures, he mentioned a technique he had used on similar terrain, offered it, and then moved on without pressing. She asked him about his ranch. He had inherited it from his father 8 years ago, and had spent those 8 years turning it into what it was now, and he talked about it with the particular combination of pride and ongoing concern that marked people who were genuinely invested in what they had built. He had no family in the immediate sense. A sister in Denver, parents long gone. He ran the ranch with a crew of 6, and he was clearly the kind of man his crew respected, which said something she had learned to pay attention to. She went to the spare room and lay in the clean dark and thought about the day. It had started with a purpose she understood and ended with a situation that was considerably more complicated. And somewhere in the middle of it, she had met a man who had kept her late husband's horse for 2 years without being asked to continue doing so, and who had done it partly out of an old loyalty to Thomas, and partly because the horse deserved better than what was threatening it. And she found that the more she thought about that, the more it told her about the kind of man Roy Fairchild was. She slept better than she had in 4 months. The next morning she came out to find Roy already in the barn, brushing copper, with the methodical attention she had noticed yesterday. She leaned against the stall door and watched him work, and in the morning light he looked like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. There was something clarifying about watching a person do something they were genuinely good at without performance or self-consciousness. "You do that every morning?" she asked. He looked up, not startled. He had heard her come in. "Most mornings," he said. "The hands do the rest of the horses. Copper I usually do myself." Because of the situation with Cole. Partly, he kept brushing in the long strokes that moved from shoulder to flank. Partly because it is a good way to start a day. Horses do not have hidden agendas. She laughed, which surprised her. It was a small sound but genuine, and he looked at her when he heard it with an expression she could not entirely read, something warm in it. "I need to go back to my property today," she said. "There are things I cannot leave unattended indefinitely, but I will need to come back for Fitch's filing process." "You are welcome any time," he said simply. She came back 3 days later and then 5 days after that. Each time there was a practical reason. A meeting with Fitch that required Roy to sign a supporting statement about Cole's visit. A question about Copper's condition that Fitch needed documented. A conversation about the challenge proceeding that they needed to coordinate. Each time there was also, underneath the practical reason, the fact that she found the Fairchild Ranch and the man who ran it to be a place, and a person she did not dread returning to, which was not a small thing for a woman who had spent 4 years learning to dread the complications that home could contain. Roy's crew, she learned, was a collection of men who had found their way to the Fairchild Ranch through various routes and stayed, because it was a good place to stay. There was Pete, who was indeed 17 and boundlessly enthusiastic, and an older man named Graham who had been with the ranch for 6 years, and said very little but moved through his work with a competence that was beautiful to watch, and 2 brothers named Louis and Marco who were Mexican-American, and who Roy treated with the same straight respect he offered everyone, which in 1882 eastern Colorado was not something every rancher did, and Jane noticed it and thought about it. She also noticed that Roy's neighbors thought well of him. The few times she was in Harlow Creek at the same time as him, she saw how people greeted him, the genuine warmth of it, not the slightly wary politeness that power often generates, but something more mutual and easy. He was a man who had built something good and done it without running over the people around him. Fitch filed the challenge in the 2nd week of October, and it was, as he had predicted, a strong one. The document Cole had produced bore Thomas's name in a signature that a closer examination showed to be subtly wrong in 4 specific and documented ways. Fitch was thorough and meticulous about it, and Jane felt a grim satisfaction in seeing the forgery exposed for what it was. Cole was informed through proper legal channels. He did not take it quietly. The night he came to the Fairchild Ranch was a Thursday, 3 weeks after Jane's first visit, and she was not there when it happened. Roy sent her a note through Pete the next morning, which was how she learned about it. Cole and 2 men had arrived after midnight. They had not gotten as far as the barn. Roy and Graham had been waiting, and Sheriff Prout, who Roy had quietly warned 2 days earlier, had been waiting as well. Cole had made threats that Prout had written down in his official capacity. One of the men with Cole had made the mistake of reaching for his sidearm, which had resulted in his immediate arrest. Cole himself had been served with a court injunction regarding the contested animal and informed that any further approach to the Fairchild property or any interference with Jane Covington's property would result in his arrest. Cole had retreated loudly, and Prout believed he would eventually cut his losses because the legal exposure was now considerable. Jane read Roy's note standing in her kitchen in the morning light and felt something she identified, after a moment, as the particular quality of relief that comes when someone has done something difficult and protective on your behalf without making it a performance or a demand. Roy had dealt with a serious threat quietly and effectively, and then simply told her about it, in a note that contained no drama and no expectation. She drove to his ranch that afternoon and knocked on the door of the main house instead of going to the barn. Mrs. Alderman let her in, and Roy came from his study where he had apparently been doing accounts, and he stood in the hallway and looked at her with an expression that was questioning and open. "Are you all right?" she asked, which surprised them both slightly because it was the first thing she said before the practical questions. "Yes," he said. "Graham took a bruise to his cheekbone, but nothing worse. Prout handled it well. Your note said one of them reached for a gun." He reconsidered quickly. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the hallway between them was full of something that neither of them had named yet, but that both of them were beginning to understand. "Come in," he said. "Mrs. Alderman has coffee." They sat in the front parlor, which was a comfortable room without pretension, and she asked the questions she had come to ask, and he answered them plainly. And then the practical questions were done, and they were sitting in the October afternoon light with their coffee cooling in the cups, and a quiet that had changed its quality from awkward to something more like companionable. "Roy," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without thinking about it first. He looked at her, The gray eyes were attentive. "When did you decide to keep taking care of Copper after Thomas died?" she asked. "The payments had stopped. You could have simply sent notice." He was quiet for a moment. She had learned in these weeks that his quiet was not evasion but thought, and she waited for it. "When the news came that Thomas had died," he said, "I thought about sending notice. I thought about it for about 2 days. And then I went out to the barn and looked at that horse, and I thought about what Thomas had been afraid of, and I thought about the fact that somewhere there was a woman who had just lost her husband and was probably dealing with more than enough already." He paused. "I figured the horse would keep, and I figured you would come when you were ready." Jane looked at him for a long moment. "You expected me." "I hoped for you," he said, and then something moved in his expression as if he had heard what he had said, and a faint color came into his weathered face. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. It was the kind of silence that stands at the edge of something and looks into it and asks whether you are ready to step forward. She was not entirely ready. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. She was a woman 4 months out of a marriage that had been complicated enough to make simple trust feel like a skill she had misplaced somewhere and needed to find again. But she was also a woman who had been paying attention, and what she had seen in these weeks was a man who did not hide things, who took care of what was in his charge, who treated people with a decency that was not contingent on what they could do for him. She drove home that evening in the long Colorado dusk and thought about it all the way, and when she reached her own property and unhitched her horse and went into her kitchen to make supper, she was still thinking about it. She came back to the Fairchild Ranch on a Saturday. This time she had no business reason, and she did not manufacture one. She came because she wanted to, and when Roy came out to meet her in the yard with a look of genuine pleasure that he did not try to conceal, she thought that perhaps honest was the best way to proceed. "I have no errand today," she said. "I came because I wanted to see how things were." He nodded, a slow smile working its way across his face in the particular way of a man who has been careful for a long time and is finding that care may not always be required. "Good," he said. "I was hoping you might be coming." They walked out to see Copper together, and Roy saddled the gelding and watched while Jane rode him in the paddock, because she had ridden him before Thomas sent him away, and she had missed it without quite knowing she had missed it. Copper moved beautifully, easy and responsive, and she felt something loosen in her that had been wound tight for a long time. Roy leaned on the paddock fence and watched her with the fence rail under his forearms and the late October sun at his back, and she could feel his attention even across the distance of the paddock, warm and steady, and not at all uncomfortable. They had lunch with Mrs. Alderman's contribution of fresh bread and cold chicken, and sat on the porch afterward in the mild afternoon, and the conversation moved through many rooms. He told her about Kansas when he was a boy and the particular quality of the flatland that you either loved or couldn't wait to leave, and she told him about Missouri and the specific grief of a landscape that had been beautiful before the war and never quite found its way back to itself. They talked about books, which surprised them both because neither had expected the other to be a reader, and then laughed at themselves for the assumption. He read history and technical manuals and occasionally novels, which he admitted with a slight sheepishness that she found endearing. She read everything she could get her hands on, which out here meant making do with whatever the general store stocked and whatever came through on the occasional traveling bookseller's cart. The afternoon stretched long and easy, and she lost track of the time in a way she had not done in years, the comfortable kind of time loss that happens when you are somewhere you do not want to leave. When the shadows grew long and the air sharpened with the evening cold, she said she ought to start back. He walked her to her buckboard. Pete had already brought her horse around, and she stood in the yard pulling on her gloves, and Roy stood a few feet away with his hands in his jacket pockets, and there was something between them that was very clearly waiting for one of them to acknowledge it. "Jane," he said. Her name in his voice had a quality she had not heard her name have in a long time. She looked at him. "I would like to see more of you," he said, "in whatever way you are comfortable with." There is no pressure. I understand it has been a difficult year and that things take the time they take. He met her eyes steadily, no deflection in it. But I would like you to know that I am glad you came, and I would be gladder if you kept coming. Jane looked at this man who had kept her husband's horse for 2 years without being asked, who had faced down a dangerous man to protect what was in his care, who had waited for her without impatience, who told her things directly and listened to her as if what she said mattered. I would like that too, she said, and the simplicity of it was its own kind of courage. He smiled then, a full one, the first she had seen from him that was entirely unguarded, and it changed his face into something that she understood, standing there in the October yard in the long Colorado evening light. She had been working toward recognizing for weeks. November came in with cold and wind, and the particular quality of pre-winter that settles over Colorado like a decision the sky has made. Jane's situation was changing slowly but demonstrably for the better. Fitch had secured a dismissal of Cole's claim and had furthermore managed to negotiate, with Roy's support and testimony, a deferral on 2 of Thomas's largest debts on the grounds that the assets in question had been subject to fraudulent claims that needed to be sorted before transfer could occur. It was not a permanent solution, but it was breathing room, and breathing room was what she needed. Roy came to her property twice in November. The first time was to look at the drainage issue she had mentioned, because he had been thinking about it and had a specific idea he wanted to walk through with her. He spent 2 hours in her south pasture with her, both of them in practical clothes against the cold, discussing water tables and soil composition, with the focused mutual attention of people who both take land seriously. His idea was good, and she said so, and they argued pleasantly about one aspect of the implementation, and arrived at a solution that was better than either of their original positions, which was the best possible outcome of that kind of conversation. The second time he came, he brought a book from his own shelf that he thought she might like, a history of the Plains territories that had come out 2 years earlier. He left it at the door because she was occupied when he arrived, and he did not want to interrupt. She found it on the doorstep with a note in his handwriting that said simply, "Thought you might find this interesting," and she sat down with it that evening and read until her lamp needed refilling. She rode to his ranch on a Sunday in the middle of November, and this time when she arrived, he was not in the barn or the yard but visible through the parlor window, and when she knocked at the door he opened it immediately, and there was a fire going, and Mrs. Alderman had apparently been in an ambitious mood, because the house smelled of fresh-baked pie and something roasting. "I was hoping it might be you," he said. She came in from the cold and the warmth of the house wrapped around her, and she stood in the hallway and he took her coat, and she noticed that he was careful with it, hung it properly on the hook, the same way he was careful with everything in his care. They sat by the fire after supper, and the conversation went somewhere deeper than it had gone before. She told him about Thomas in the honest way that she had not yet been able to tell anyone, the real version that included both the tenderness she had genuinely felt and the ways in which she had spent 4 years gradually discovering that the man she had married was not entirely the man she had thought. She was not angry as she told it, or not only angry. There was grief in it, and the particular exhaustion of having carried something complicated for a long time. Roy listened. He did not defend Thomas, which she had half expected given their history, but he did not condemn him either, which she found she appreciated more. He simply listened and then said quietly that it sounded like Thomas had been a man who wanted to be better than he was capable of being, which was its own kind of tragedy and did not entirely excuse the harm but made it comprehensible. "Did you know about the cattle?" she asked. The investigation Sheriff Pruitt had mentioned. Roy was quiet for a moment. "I suspected something was wrong," he said. "Not the specifics, but I knew Thomas was in over his head in ways he wasn't telling people. It was part of why I agreed to take the horse when he asked. It felt like the one thing I could actually do." She nodded slowly. "You could not have told me." "I didn't know enough to tell you anything useful," he said, And Thomas asked me not to." He paused. "I have thought about that decision since you came, whether I should have found a way. I don't have a clean answer for it." That honesty cost him something. She could see it did, and she liked him considerably better for being willing to pay it. The fire settled and the evening deepened, and they sat in the warm room, and the distance between them on the settee had gradually, in the way of natural things, reduced itself without either of them engineering it. At some point she had turned slightly toward him and he had turned slightly toward her, and the book she had brought to return to him was between them on the cushion, but neither of them was paying it any attention. "Jane," he said. "Yes," she said, and it was an answer to something he had not yet asked. He reached out and took her hand, the simple warm weight of his hand around hers, and it was such a straightforward gesture that it went directly past all her caution and landed somewhere very central. They sat like that for a long time, not talking, the fire going and the wind outside and the warmth between them, and it was the most peaceful she had felt in longer than she could clearly remember. He walked her out to her buckboard when she left, and he held her hand the whole way across the yard, and at the buckboard he helped her up and held her hand a moment longer before letting go, and she drove home in the dark Colorado night feeling like something that had been very cold for a long time was beginning to be warm again. December came, and with it the winter that the plateau had been preparing for all of November. The ground froze and the sky made good on its threats, and the snow came in horizontal curtains that turned the horizon white and blurred the line between land and sky. Jane's property needed constant attention in weather like this, pipes to watch and cattle to account for, and 100 small emergencies that were the particular occupation of a rancher in a Colorado winter. Roy sent Pete over on the worst days with firewood, and once, during a stretch when the temperature dropped low enough to freeze the water in the pipes before she could manage it, he came himself with Louis and Marco, and they spent the better part of a day sorting the situation. She fed them all at her kitchen table, and afterward, when the crew had gone back to their horses, Roy stayed for an hour by her fire and they talked quietly, and she found that she was entirely comfortable with him in her house, which was its own kind of statement about how far things had come. She could see what he was doing and what he was not doing, and she appreciated both. He was present and consistent and warm, but he was not crowding her. He did not make assumptions. He did not press. He understood, she thought, that she was a person who needed to find her way to things rather than be led to them, and he was the kind of man who could be patient with that, genuinely patient rather than performatively patient. Christmas in 1882 on the Colorado Plateau was a quiet affair. Harlow Creek had a small celebration at the church, which Jane attended with the general understanding that church attendance in small frontier towns served as many social as spiritual functions, and Roy was there as well, and they sat near each other in the pew without it being remarkable because they had become, in the way of small communities, an understood pair in the eyes of the town, even before they had fully become one in their own. After the service, there was a general gathering at the Harlow Creek Meeting Hall with food and music, a fiddler and someone's son on a battered piano, and Roy asked her to dance with a self-consciousness that she found charming because it sat oddly on a man who was otherwise so composed. She had not danced in years. She had not particularly wanted to. But she put her hand in his and let him lead her into the simple reel that the fiddler was playing, and discovered that he was good at it, the easy competence of someone who had danced his whole life, and that dancing with him was like most things with him, something that felt natural and easy in ways she had not expected. They danced twice more and then stood near the wall and watched the rest of the room with the particular comfort of two people who are happy where they are and do not need to perform it for anyone. His arm was behind her on the wall, not quite around her but present, and she leaned back slightly into that presence and felt him notice that she had done it. On New Year's Day she rode to his ranch in the cold, clear air and found him in the barn as she always did, And this time when he looked up and saw her, there was nothing complicated in his expression at all. Just gladness, simple and unguarded. "Happy New Year," she said. "It's improving," he said, and the way he was looking at her when he said it left no ambiguity about what he meant. She walked across the barn to where he was standing and stopped within arm's reach of him and looked up at him, and she thought about the story of the past 3 months, all the incremental steps of it, and she thought that she had arrived at a place where she was ready to stop moving incrementally. "Roy," she said. "Yes," he said, exactly as she had said it to him in November, the same inflection, and she understood that he recognized what he was doing. She reached up and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss, not a question. She had made her decision before she rode over here this morning, and she kissed him the way you do something you have thought about carefully and are entirely certain of. He kissed her back with the same quality, not tentative, entirely there, his hands coming up to hold her with a steadiness that was entirely characteristic of him. And Copper watched from his stall with the equanimity of an animal that had seen many things and judged none of them. When they separated, they were both quiet for a moment, and then she laughed again, the same genuine surprising laugh she had produced in this barn back in October, and he smiled the full unguarded smile, and the morning light came through the high windows of the barn, and it was a good beginning to a year. January was cold and February was colder, and they moved through the winter with the easy rhythm of two people who had settled into each other's company, with the kind of confidence that grows from genuine compatibility rather than convenience. He courted her properly, by the standards of the time and place, which meant visits and correspondence and occasions in public that made their connection clear and respectable. He brought her wildflowers when the first ones came up through the late winter snow, a small bunch of them, handed over with a slight awkwardness that was entirely endearing. She met his sister Catherine when Catherine came from Denver in February to see the ranch and check on her brother, which was a thin excuse that Catherine herself did not bother to maintain for very long. Catherine was a direct woman in her early 30s, handsome and smart and very clearly assessing Jane with the thorough and unapologetic attention of someone who loves their sibling and wants to be sure. Jane assessed her right back, which Catherine seemed to appreciate, and by the end of the first evening they had established a mutual respect that had the foundations of a real friendship. Catherine pulled her aside before supper on the second night and told her, with the direct manner that apparently ran in the family, that Roy had not looked like himself in a long time. That he had been running this ranch with his full energy and ability for 8 years, and it had been good and he had been fine. But that fine and good were not the same thing as happy, and that he looked happy now, genuinely happy, in a way she had not seen since before their parents died. Jane absorbed that and said she was glad, and Catherine looked at her with the specific warmth of a woman who means more than she's saying, and they went in to supper and Roy looked between them with the slight wariness of a man who knows 2 perceptive women have been talking about him, and is not entirely sure what was decided. By March, the legal situation with Thomas's debts was reaching its final shape. Fitch had done his careful work, and 2 of the 3 major creditors had agreed to terms that Jane could manage, extended repayment arrangements that would require diligence, but were survivable. The 3rd creditor had accepted the sale of the 2 back acres of the Covington property, which Jane had agreed to with more equanimity than she might have felt 6 months earlier. The acres in question were not productive land. What remained was the core of the property, the house and barn and pasture, and it was enough to build on. Copper was officially hers, free of any contest, and Fitch had been thorough enough in his filing that Cole had eventually signed off on the matter as well, which Sheriff Prout believed had been motivated less by decency than by the understanding that further pursuit of the matter would result in an examination of several other aspects of Cole's business that would not survive scrutiny. Either way, the outcome was the same. The question of Copper's future was one Jane had thought about carefully. She needed the money he represented. Selling a well-kept, well-trained bay gelding in good condition in 1883 in Colorado would bring a meaningful sum. But she found, when she actually considered it, that she did not want to sell him. She brought this up with Roy one evening in March, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee and the easy comfort of people who have spent enough time together that silence is no longer something to fill. "I know it is not the practical choice," she said. He looked at her with the careful attention that she had come to love. "What do you want to do with him?" "Keep him," she said. "Which probably means keeping him here, since my property doesn't have the same capacity yours does." He was quiet for a moment. "Jane," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name that made her look at him more directly. He reached across the table and took her hand. He had been doing that since January, taking her hand at moments that mattered, and she had come to understand it as a language he spoke alongside words. "I have been thinking about something," he said. "I have been thinking about it for a while, and I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve plainness." "Yes," she said. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the property or the debts or the horse or any practical consideration. Because I love you and I think we are good together, and because I would like us to build something together that is ours, yours and mine." He paused. "But I also want you to know that if the timing is not right, or if you need more time to be certain, I will wait. I am telling you this now because I have been wanting to tell you, and I think you ought to know where I stand." Jane looked at him. The kitchen was warm and the lamp was low, and outside the late March wind was talking to the walls of the house. And she thought about the morning 4 months ago when she had walked into this man's barn with a simple purpose and found something entirely different. She thought about the horse gleaming in the stall. She thought about Roy's hands on the brush, the cedar nameplate, the hay that was always fresh. She thought about what it meant that a man had kept something carefully tended for 2 years on behalf of a person he had not yet met, out of loyalty and decency, and the simple understanding that some things are worth taking care of. She thought about what it meant to be taken care of by someone who did it because they wanted to and not because they wanted something in return. "Yes," she said. "Roy, yes." He exhaled, a long, slow breath that had something in it she recognized as relief, real relief, the kind that comes when something you have been hoping for very carefully finally arrives. He brought her hand up and pressed it to his mouth, a long, warm press of his lips against her knuckles, and she felt it in the center of her chest. They married in May of 1883. The ceremony was in the small church in Harlow Creek, officiated by the Reverend Aldous March, who was a gentle man with a long beard and a reputation for getting through the ceremony without excessive editorializing, which Roy had specifically requested. Catherine came from Denver with her husband, a quiet architect named Daniel who seemed to genuinely love her, and Pete and Graham and Louis and Marco were there in their Sunday best, and Harold Fitch was there in his dry, precise way, and Mrs. Alderman was there and cried effectively through the whole thing. Jane wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the winter months, because she was a practical woman and deep blue did not show where the way white did, and she had thought about this for long enough that she had no ambivalence about it. Roy wore his best suit, dark gray, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle with an expression that she was going to remember for the rest of her life. It was not a complicated ceremony. They had both had enough of complicated things. They said the words clearly and meant them, and Roy held her hands the whole time, that steady, warm hold. And when the Reverend pronounced them married, Roy kissed her in a way that made Pete whoop from the pew and several other people laugh and Mrs. Alderman cry harder. The reception was at the Harlow Creek Meeting Hall with food, and the same fiddler from Christmas and considerably more dancing than Jane had anticipated. She danced with Roy 3 times and with Pete once, which she owed him for the whoop, and with Daniel once, and she watched Roy dance with Catherine and saw between them the easy affection of siblings who genuinely like each other, which she had known intellectually but liked seeing expressed in motion. At some point in the evening, she found herself standing near the door with Catherine, watching Roy talk with Graham and Lewis near the fiddler. "He is happy," Catherine said. "Yes," Jane said. "So are you," Catherine said, which was not a question. "Yes," Jane said again, and it was the simplest and most complete thing she had said in some time. They moved Jane's things to the Fairchild Ranch in the 2 weeks following the wedding. The Covington property was leased to a young couple who had come west with aspirations and good health, and not much else, which Jane felt good about. The property would be worked by people who needed it, and she retained ownership, and the lease income gave her an independence she wanted to maintain, which Roy understood and supported without requiring her to argue for it. The Fairchild Ranch became her ranch in the way that a place becomes yours, gradually, and then suddenly. She brought her knowledge and her attention to it, and Roy made room for both without making her feel like a guest in her own home. They were good together in the practical ways that matter enormously in a working ranch life, the daily decisions and the labor, and the ongoing negotiation of how two people share a space and a life. They disagreed sometimes, and when they disagreed they said so, and mostly they arrived at something better than either of their original positions, which was a pattern she had first noticed in the south pasture in November and was pleased to find continued. Copper lived in the barn with the other Fairchild horses, settled in the comfortable authority of a horse that has been well treated for long enough that he expects it as his due. In the mornings Jane sometimes brushed him and sometimes Roy did, and occasionally they did it together, standing on either side of the horse in the early light while the ranch woke up around them. The summer of 1883 was a good one. The ranch prospered as it had always prospered under Roy's management, and with Jane's attention to the books and her particular talent for identifying where resources were being wasted, it prospered a little more. She reorganized the supply ordering system in a way that saved them money each month, and Roy adopted her suggestion without a syllable of defensiveness, which continued to delight her. Garrett Cole, she heard through the general circulation of information in a small frontier community, had eventually moved his operation east into Kansas, having concluded that eastern Colorado had become inhospitable to his methods. Sheriff Prout reported this to Jane with something that resembled satisfaction, and she felt a clean closure to that particular chapter. By fall she knew she was expecting a child. She told Roy on an October evening, a year almost to the day since she had first walked into his barn, and he sat very still for a moment, and then looked at her with an expression so unguarded that she thought her chest might not be able to contain everything she felt. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing he said, the immediate instinct of a man whose first concern was her. "Very well," she said. "Tired sometimes, but well." He came around the table and gathered her into a careful hold, the kind that knows what it is holding, and she leaned into him, and they stood there in the kitchen in the October evening, and the future that they had built together made itself very real. Their son was born in June of 1884, a substantial and healthy boy with Roy's dark hair and Jane's particular expression of focused consideration, which was apparent from the first days. They named him James Thomas, James for Jane's father and Thomas in the way of honoring complexity, because Thomas Covington had been a flawed and difficult man, but he had been part of the chain of events that had led Jane to this barn and this man and this life, and she had arrived, eventually, at a place where she could hold that with some charity. James Thomas Fairchild was, from his first weeks, a person of considerable opinions. He expressed them loudly and specifically, and Roy held him in the evenings and walked him around the kitchen, and talked to him in the low, patient voice he used for horses, which Jane watched from the table with a full heart and a cup of tea. Catherine and Daniel visited that summer, and Catherine held her nephew with the absorbed attention of a woman who has been waiting for this particular person to arrive in the world. Daniel drew careful sketches of the baby's sleeping face with the professional precision of an architect, accustomed to capturing exact lines, and Roy kept one of the sketches in his study on the wall above his desk. By the time James was learning to pull himself up on furniture and look out the window at the yard with enormous interested eyes, Jane was expecting again. This one arrived in the spring of 1886, another boy, whom they named Henry Roy, and Henry came into the world with his mother's hair, and a disposition of absolute serenity that seemed to surprise and delight everyone who met him. He was the kind of baby who looked at the world with the satisfied expression of someone who had arrived exactly where he had always planned to be. James, who was not quite 2 when Henry arrived, inspected the baby with the focused attention that was becoming his signature trait, and then turned to his parents and announced, in the emerging language of a child who is very sure of everything, that the baby was satisfactory. Roy and Jane exchanged a look over James's head that contained 17 years of shared life compressed into a single moment. The Covington property, leased to the young couple who had proved themselves excellent tenants, was thriving. Jane visited occasionally and felt a warmth toward it that was no longer complicated by grief or anger or confusion. It was a piece of land that had been part of her story and was now being well used by people who needed it, which was about as good an outcome as she could have asked for. She had written to Thomas's family in Kansas briefly about his death and the situation, and had received a letter back from his mother that was stiff and a little defensive but contained, in its last lines, a genuine acknowledgment that Thomas had not always done right by her, which she had not expected and which had meant something. In the summer of 1886, Jane and Roy rode out together on a clear hot Tuesday to look at the northern fence line, which needed attention. They rode side by side through the tall grass, the kind of grass that moves in waves in the summer wind and makes the land look like it is breathing, and the ranch was full of the sounds of summer, the insects and the birds and the far-off lowing of cattle and the sound of Pete, now 22 and no longer boyish though still enthusiastic, calling something to Lewis across the south pasture. They pulled up on a low rise that gave them a view of the whole of the ranch, the buildings and the pastures, and the far blue line of the mountains on the western horizon. The sky was the particular profound blue of a Colorado summer, the kind of sky that makes you feel like you are at the top of the world and it is a good place to be. Roy looked at the view and then looked at her, and she was already looking at him. "Good," he said. She understood he was asking about all of it. The ranch, the life, the choice she had made when she had said yes in his kitchen, the accumulation of everything that had followed. She looked at this man who had kept a horse carefully tended for 2 years on behalf of a woman he had not yet met, who had faced down a dangerous man to protect what was in his care, who had told her the truth when the truth was uncomfortable and waited for her without impatience, and loved her without conditions, and held her hands through the whole ceremony in that small church, and looked at her walking down the aisle like she was something worth every minute of the wait. "Perfect," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, the same warm, steady hold he had offered her from the beginning, and the summer wind moved through the grass, and the mountains held their blue line on the horizon, and the ranch spread out below them. Theirs, built together, and she thought about the morning she had driven her buckboard through a stranger's gate with a widow's grief and a practical purpose, and left with the beginning of everything else. She thought about what it meant that the horse was still here, in the barn below them, fat and glossy and entirely at home. She thought about the nameplate Roy had carved, the cedar and the careful letters, the evidence of attention given freely to something in his care. She thought about how a person shows you who they are in the small things, the ordinary things, the daily evidence of their regard. She had come to ask about a horse. She had found a man who understood in his bones the value of taking care of something well. And in learning that about him, she had understood that this was the quality she had always been looking for, the kind of care that does not advertise itself, does not diminish the object of its attention, does not require gratitude or reciprocity to continue. She had found it. She had kept it. They had built something out of it together that neither of them could have built alone, which was the particular magic of genuine partnership, the way two people's capacities can combine into something neither of them contained separately. The autumn of 1887 came with its gold and its clarity, and with a letter from Harold Fitch informing her that the young couple leasing the Covington property had expressed interest in purchasing it. He had taken the liberty of having the land assessed and had attached the figure. It was a fair figure, perhaps even slightly generous, and Fitch recommended accepting it if she was inclined. She discussed it with Roy that evening at the kitchen table, the same table where he had proposed to her 4 years earlier, James asleep upstairs and Henry asleep in the cradle near the fireplace and the lamp between them throwing its warm circle. "It is your decision," Roy said, which she had known he would say and which she loved him for saying. "I know," she said. "What do you think?" He considered it with the careful attention he brought to everything. "I think you do not need it in the way you needed it before," he said. "I think it has served its purpose, and the people on it are ready to make it theirs. And I think there is something to be said for letting a chapter close cleanly." She nodded slowly. She had been thinking something very similar. The Covington property had been a survival rope she had held onto through the worst of it, the thing that stood between her and having nothing. But she did not need a rope now. She was not drowning. She was standing on solid ground she had helped to build. She wrote back to Fitch the next day and told him to proceed with the sale. The money from the sale went into the Fairchild Ranch as a proper investment, Jane's contribution to the enterprise that was now as much hers as his, and Roy used it to hire 2 additional hands and repair the north barn and purchase a piece of equipment for the spring that made the haying considerably more efficient. And all of these things made the ranch stronger, which made their life more secure, which was the ongoing work of people building something that is meant to last. James started school in Harlow Creek in 1889, riding in with Pete on the mornings Pete went to town, sitting up very straight on his small horse with the composed dignity of a 5-year-old who has never doubted that he belongs precisely where he is. He came home full of information and opinions, and occasionally with the dust of the schoolyard fight on him, which he reported with complete openness, because he had been raised by 2 people who valued honesty, and which Roy and Jane addressed with the same combination of seriousness and fairness that they applied to everything else. Henry, 3 years younger, watched his brother's departure to school with the same serene certainty that characterized everything about him, in the comfortable knowledge that his time would come. In the spring of 1890, Jane discovered she was expecting again. She was 34 years old and Roy was 43, and they had not been expecting this, and they were, both of them, entirely delighted. She told him in the kitchen on a March morning with the spring light coming through the window, and he looked at her with the same expression he had produced in 1883 when she had told him about James, the same complete unguarded joy. "3," he said. "3," she confirmed. He came to her and held her with the same careful hold, the same knowledge of what he was holding, and she leaned into him and they stood there in the morning kitchen, and the ranch was waking up around them, and the future continued to make itself real. The 3rd child was a girl, which surprised Jane not because she had expected otherwise, but because there was something complete about it, the sense of a shape resolving into its final form. They named her Margaret Catherine, the Margaret for Roy's mother and the Catherine for Roy's sister, who received this news via telegraph from Denver and sent back a response that was entirely characteristic of her, 3 lines long and unmistakably moved. Margaret Catherine Fairchild arrived in November of 1890 with her mother's hair and her father's gray eyes, and an expression that managed to combine, from her very first hours, both of her parents' most characteristic qualities, the focused attention and the steady patience. She was a small and specific person from the beginning, entirely herself. Roy held her the evening of her birth, sitting in the chair by the bedroom fire while Jane rested, the baby wrapped against his chest, and he talked to her in the low, quiet voice he used for horses and for the two boys in their young years. And Jane watched from the bed with the particular fullness that is not happiness exactly, but contains happiness as one of its principal components. "Hello, Margaret," Roy said softly. "You have come to a good place." Jane closed her eyes and listened to the fire and the wind outside and the sound of her husband's voice talking their daughter into the world, and thought that truer words had not been spoken in this house. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, each one building on the last, the ranch growing in the orderly way of something tended with consistent care, the children growing into their particular selves. James became, at 9 and 10, a boy of considerable intellectual curiosity who wanted to know the reason for everything and would not accept a vague answer, which his parents considered fair. Henry became, at 7 and 8, a person of surprising warmth and social instinct, the one who noticed when someone in the community needed something and mentioned it matter-of-factly, as if of course this was something to be attended to. Margaret, at 4 and 5, was a girl who had decided that horses were her primary area of interest, which surprised no one who knew her family history, and who spent hours at the fence of Copper's paddock, talking to the bay gelding with the complete seriousness of important business. Copper was an old horse now, 17 in 1893, his muzzle graying and his pace more measured, but he was still a sound and comfortable animal with the placid dignity of a horse that has been well loved for a long time. Roy kept his stall clean and his hay fresh and his coat brushed, the same as always, the same daily attention that had been there from the beginning. Jane sometimes stood at the barn door in the morning and watched Roy with the old horse, the familiar long strokes of the brush, the quiet between them, and she thought about the cedar nameplate and the story that had begun there, all the threads of it, the hidden things and the secrets and the complicated grief, and the slow, patient, growing thing that had come out the other side of all of it. She thought about coming here for the first time with a practical purpose and a widow's wariness and finding, in a dusty barn in October 1882, the evidence of a man's character written in the care of a horse that was not his responsibility. She thought about how the most important things often arrive disguised as practical matters. One afternoon in the summer of 1893, when the children were occupied and the ranch was running in its steady summer way, Jane walked out to the barn and found Roy there, as she so often found him, and she stood in the barn door and looked at the light coming through the high windows and the old horse in his stall and the man who had kept him so well for so many years. "Roy," she said. He looked up. "I have been thinking about the day I came here to ask about Copper," she said. He smiled the slow smile. "That was a good day." "I did not know that when I arrived," she said. "No," he said. "I think you were not inclined to trust the day." She walked into the barn and stood beside him at Copper's stall, and the old horse turned his gray muzzle toward her, and she laid her hand on the warm, solid weight of his neck. "I understand now why you kept him so well," she said. Roy looked at her. The gray eyes were the same as they had always been, attentive and warm and entirely present. "Tell me," he said. "Because you are a man who takes care of what is in your charge," she said. "Because you understood that the horse had nothing to do with Thomas's mistakes and deserved better than to bear the consequences of them. Because you were keeping him for someone you had not met yet, on the chance that she might come and need him to be worth something." She paused. "And because you are the kind of person who does not do things by halves. If you are going to take care of something, you are going to take care of it properly, and it does not matter whether anyone is watching or whether anyone will ever know." Roy was quiet for a moment. Copper breathed softly under her hand. "That is a generous reading," Roy said. "It is an accurate one," she said. "I have had 11 years to observe you. I know what I am talking about." He reached out and took her hand the way he had always taken her hand, the same simple warm hold, and they stood together in the barn with the afternoon light falling through the windows and the old horse between them and the ranch around them. their children's voices carrying faintly from somewhere outside, the sound of the life they had built together sounding exactly the way a life built on solid ground sounds. She looked at the nameplate above the stall. Cedar, carved careful. Copper. It had been there for 13 years now, since before she had come, since before she had been anything to Roy Fairchild but the unknown wife of a man he had grown up near. And it had weathered and darkened, but it was still there, still legible, still the daily evidence of attention paid without expectation. She thought about all the things that had seemed like endings that had turned out to be beginnings. Thomas's death, which had felt like the closing of a door, had turned out to be the opening of a road she had not known existed. Her arrival here with a widow's grief and a practical errand had turned out to be the first step of the most important journey she had ever made. The horse she had come to sell had turned out to be the key to a story she had not known she was living, and the man who had kept the horse so well had turned out to be exactly who he appeared to be, which was rarer than it should have been and more precious than she could have known to wish for. "Roy," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping him, for being here, for all of it." He looked at her with the full, unguarded expression she had loved from the first time she had seen it clearly, the one that contained everything he felt without reservation or performance. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. "Thank you for staying." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood there in the warm barn in the summer afternoon, the old horse breathing quietly beside them, the ranch alive around them, the children's voices in the distance, and the whole long good story of what they had built together settled around them like the particular quiet of a place that is exactly what it was always meant to be. Copper lived 2 more years, passing in the spring of 1895 in the way that old horses pass when they have been well cared for, peacefully, and in his own time. Roy and Jane buried him in the south field under a cottonwood tree, and Roy made a marker for the spot from cedar, the same wood as the nameplate, with the same careful carving. Margaret, who was 4 at the time and had loved that old horse with the wholehearted devotion of a child, held her father's hand at the marker and was sad with the complete honesty of a child's grief. And Roy told her about Copper's history, the whole story of it, how the horse had come from her mother's first life, and had been the reason her mother had come to the ranch, which was the reason that all of them were here. Margaret listened with the focused attention she had inherited from her mother, and then she looked at the cedar marker, and then she looked up at her father and said, in the specific language of a 4-year-old who has understood something important, "So the horse is why we are a family." Roy looked at Jane over their daughter's head, and Jane looked back at him, and in the look between them was 11 years and 3 children, and 1,000 mornings in the barn, and a wedding in a small church, and the complete accumulation of a life built from something that had begun with a widow walking into a barn on an October morning with a practical purpose and an open question, and a heart that had not yet learned what it was capable of becoming. "Yes," Roy said to his daughter. "In a way, that is exactly right." The summer after Copper's death, they purchased a new horse for Margaret from a breeder in Pueblo, a small roan mare with an even temper and enormous eyes, and Margaret named her Penny with the complete authority of a child who has known the right name from the first moment. And Roy built a cedar nameplate for the new stall above the old one, and the barn went on being what it had always been. A place where things were kept carefully and tended well, and the daily evidence of genuine care was written in the clean hay, and the clean water and the names above the doors. James, at 11, was developing into a young man of considerable promise, already talking about the university in Boulder, with the focused ambition that his parents recognized as genuine vocation. Henry, at 8, had become the unofficial diplomat of the school in Harlow Creek, the one all the teachers relied on to smooth the inevitable difficulties of children learning to be together, a talent that seemed to come from somewhere very native in him. And Margaret ran the barnyard with the confident authority of a person who has found her domain. Jane and Roy sat on the porch in the evenings, as they had sat on the porch in all the evenings of all the years, and the ranch was quiet around them in the way of things that are well and whole, and the stars came out over the Colorado Plateau in their vast and indifferent beauty, and they were two people who had found each other in a complicated way and built something simple and good out of it, and the story was still going, would still go on after the telling of it. But it had arrived at the place where the shape of it was clear, and the foundation of it was solid, and the future that lay ahead of them was continuous with everything that had come before. A good year comes and a good year goes, and the land holds what is planted in it, and the barn holds what is kept in it, and the heart holds what it has chosen to make room for. And all of it, the whole long patient accumulation of it, amounts in the end to this. A woman came to ask about a horse, and found in the asking the answer to a question she had not known she was carrying. And a man kept the horse because it was the right thing to do, and found in the keeping a reason that was better than he had dared to hope for. And between the two of them, they built a life that was the exact opposite of the hidden things and the dark secrets and the forced choices and the bitter betrayals that had surrounded them at the beginning. They built something open, something tended, something that bore the names of the things it cared for in cedar above the doors, visible to anyone who walked in, legible in the clean hay and the morning light and the warm weight of a hand held steady through all the years. That was the story. That was all of it, and all of it was enough.